The air smelled of dust and lilac that summer evening, the kind that comes before a storm but holds its breath too long. The sun had already sunk behind the low hills, leaving the old American village painted in shades of copper and shadow. Wooden porches creaked under the weight of tired men, their boots caked with dirt from the mines and cattle trails. Women's voices floated faintly through the streets, soft and tired, humming tunes that belonged to a world gentler than this one. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a coyote cried, long and lonely, as if it mourned something that hadn't yet happened. Down near the river, where the air turned cooler and the fireflies came out early, she stood barefoot in the grass. Her dress was pale blue and worn thin at the edges, her hair loose, catching the fading light like gold dust. The village said she had a wild streak in her, something untamed that no preacher's words or mother's sighs could soften. They whispered she was born under a blood moon, that her fate was tied to things best left unspoken. But she didn't care for whispers. She cared only for the sound of the river and the low rumble of hooves that sometimes came from the southern plains. That was where he came from, the Apache with eyes the color of rain on stone. The villagers said his people rode like shadows, moving through canyons in moonlight as if the land itself obeyed them. They said he was dangerous, a raider, a ghost who could vanish between heartbeats. Yet when she saw him that first night, standing beyond the cornfields, she didn't see danger. She saw something that made her heart stumble, a sorrow that mirrored her own. The war between settlers and the Apache had been quiet for months then, held in uneasy truce. The soldiers from the fort patrolled the trails, keeping an eye on both sides, pretending peace could last when hunger and grief still burned hot. The old men at the saloon spat tobacco and muttered that it was only a matter of time before the fires came again. But to her, it didn't matter what flags men raised or which stories they told. She only knew that every time the wind came from the south, she felt him in it, like a whisper calling her name. One night, when the moon was full and the village slept under its silver glow, she heard it again, the sound of hooves by the riverbank. Her heart beat faster as she slipped out from the house, her bare feet quiet against the dirt. He was there, waiting in the shadows, tall and silent, his horse restless behind him. The air between them trembled like the space before a storm breaks. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though she didn't mean it. His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "You came," he said simply. His voice was low, carrying both warning and wonder. They stood close enough to see the faint scars on his cheek, the kind that spoke of battles won and lost. She wanted to reach out, to trace them, to ask about the pain that lived in those lines, but she didn't. Instead, she said, "If they see you, they'll kill you." He smiled faintly, a weary sort of smile. "Then I'll ride before they wake." She looked back toward the dim lights of the village, the place that had never quite felt like home. "You'll leave again," she said. "You always do." "Because your people hate mine," he answered, his voice turning rough. "And mine. They don't forget what your soldiers did." She swallowed, her throat tight. "And yet, you come." He looked at her a long while before speaking again. "Because of you." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from far-off campfires. Crickets sang, and somewhere a barn door slammed. It felt like the whole world held its breath as she stepped closer. "Then take me with you," she said suddenly, her words trembling but certain. "I'm yours." The words hung between them, fragile as glass, dangerous as fire. His expression changed. Something fierce flickered in his eyes, something both tender and torn. He shook his head slowly. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she insisted. "There's nothing here for me." "Not anymore." He turned away, gripping his horse's reins tight. "If I take you, they'll come after us. They'll burn the land to find you." She moved closer until her hand brushed his arm. "Let them," she whispered. "Let them try." And for a moment, the whole world seemed to stop. He reached out, brushed her cheek with his thumb, and she felt the roughness of his hand, the truth of him. Then, without another word, he lifted her onto his horse. They rode south, vanishing into the night, swallowed by wind and starlight. By morning, the village awoke to silence, and then to panic. Her bed was empty, her footprints led to the river, and beside them, the tracks of a horse no one recognized. The preacher called it sin. Her mother called it madness. The men called it an insult. They gathered rifles and horses, swearing to bring her back to make an example of him. The air filled with the clang of metal and the smell of gun oil. But none of them knew what had passed between the two hearts that night, or how deep the longing had run. None of them could understand that she hadn't been stolen. She had chosen to go. Days turned into weeks. Smoke was seen rising from the plains. Soldiers from the fort rode out and never came back. The settlers grew restless, frightened. Some packed their wagons, others sharpened their knives. Word came through a trader that the Apache were on the move again, and that among them rode a warrior with a woman who spoke his tongue and refused to leave his side. Then, one red dawn, it happened. The ground trembled before the first cry was heard. Riders came from the south, the horizon lit with fire. The Apache swept through like a storm, their torches turning the sky orange. The villagers screamed, scrambling for rifles, for prayer, for mercy. And at the center of it all he rode, a shadow against the flames, his face grim, his eyes burning. He had come not for war but for love, for her. They had taken her back days before, dragging her from the canyon where they'd found her living among his people. The village called it rescue. He called it theft. When she saw the fire from her window that morning, she knew. She knew he'd come for her, and she ran to the door, shouting through the smoke, "Take me with you, I'm yours." Her cry carried through the chaos, through the crackle of burning roofs and the screams of men. For a moment he saw her hair loose, her hands reaching out from the porch. He kicked his horse forward, cutting through the flames, his heart pounding louder than the guns. But then a shot rang out. The sound split the air, sharp and merciless. He turned, searching, his breath ragged. The world blurred, fire, smoke, faces twisting in terror. Somewhere he heard her cry again, faint and broken. He reached out, but the crowd swallowed her, and he vanished into the blaze. By the time the sun rose, the village was nothing but ashes. The river smoked, the sky pale and empty. Those who survived spoke of the Apache who burned the town for love, of the woman who had called out to him through the flames. Some swore they saw them both riding west as dawn broke, her arms around him, her hair catching the light like gold. Others said she died in the fire, that her spirit still lingered near the river, waiting for him to return. No one truly knew, but on certain nights when the wind comes from the south and the moon burns red, the old ones say you can still hear her voice across the plains, soft, trembling, calling through the smoke, "Take me with you, I'm yours." And somewhere beyond the hills, an answering cry rides back on the wind. The days after the fire felt heavy, as though the earth itself was mourning. Smoke still rose from the charred remains of the village, curling upward into a pale sky that refused to turn blue again. Ash covered the ground like snow, and the wind carried the faint scent of what once was, burned wood, lost memories, and something deeper, almost human. The few who survived worked quietly, their voices hushed, eyes hollow. Children clung to their mothers, men rebuilt fences that no longer had homes to guard. No one spoke her name anymore. They called her the girl who ran with the Apache, or sometimes just the cause of it all. But even in whispers there was more sorrow than blame. Some said she was taken against her will, others that she betrayed her own kind. Truth was hard to hold on to when everyone's hands were shaking. Old Sheriff Willard, gray beard, tired eyes, was one of the few who'd seen her before the fire. He remembered the way she used to wander near the river at dusk, her skirts brushing the reeds, her eyes lost somewhere far away. He remembered warning her father about the Apache trails nearby. "You keep her close," he had said. "There's been trouble before." But the man had only nodded, weary and beaten by a life that gave him little but dust. Now, that same father sat on the steps of what remained of his home, staring at the blackened fields. His hands were cracked and blistered, his face half hidden beneath soot. He said little. Some thought grief had silenced him. Others believed he'd seen something that night that took the voice clean out of him. The preacher tried to gather what was left of his flock under the old oak tree. He spoke of forgiveness and God's mysterious ways, his voice trembling like the branches above him. "She was lost," he said one morning, "but perhaps she found something we never did, something beyond the fences of this world." The crowd murmured uneasily. A few bowed their heads. Most just stared at the horizon, where the hills rose like ghosts. That horizon had always been both promise and curse. Beyond it lay Apache land, rugged, wild, and beautiful in a way that frightened those who didn't understand it. The settlers told stories of their raids, of arrows in the night and stolen cattle. But there were other stories too, quieter ones told by traders who'd traveled deep enough to know better. Stories of families who just wanted peace, who had lost as much as anyone else. It was from one such trader that news came weeks later. He rode in on a pale horse, his hat low, dust clinging to his coat. The people gathered around as he dismounted, every face marked with curiosity and fear. "You've seen them?" Sheriff Willard asked. The trader nodded slowly, his eyes shadowed. "I seen smoke in the canyons," he said. "Not war smoke, campfires. And I seen a woman there, blonde hair. Not one of theirs." A hush fell over the crowd. Her mother gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "She was alive?" the sheriff asked quietly. The traitor hesitated. "Looked it. She was sitting by the fire tending a child." The words struck the air like thunder. For a moment no one moved. Then the whispers started again, sharper this time, mixed with disbelief. "She had a child?" someone asked. "His?" The traitor didn't answer. He looked away toward the burned hills. Didn't stay to ask. "You don't linger long in those parts." But she didn't look afraid. She looked at peace. Peace. The word didn't sit well with the villagers. How could there be peace after what had happened? After the lives lost and the homes turned to ash? To them, her choice, whatever it had been, was a scar that wouldn't heal. But to the sheriff, it stirred something else. He'd seen too many wars, too much hate. He'd watched men destroy what they couldn't understand. And though he'd never say it aloud, he wondered if she had done what everyone wished they could. Walk away from the endless cycle of fear and blame. Still, the law didn't rest easy. The soldiers from the fort returned soon after, their uniforms still clean, their words cold. They asked questions, took names, demanded witnesses. They wanted to know who had started the fire, who had led the Apache there, who had opened the door to chaos. When they asked about her, the sheriff hesitated. He could have said she was gone, that she'd vanished with the man who loved her. But he looked at her father then, tired, broken, lost, and instead said, "She's dead." The officer nodded, writing it down. "Then may God have mercy," he said flatly. That night, the sheriff rode out alone to the river. The moon reflected off the water, silver and still. He saw her footprints again, faint, almost erased by time, leading into the shallows. He remembered the story she used to tell as a child, about mermaids and angels who fell in love with mortals. He remembered the way she'd looked toward the hills, like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. He stayed there a long time, listening to the water move. Somewhere far off, he thought he heard the faint sound of a flute, a soft, distant melody that seemed to rise from the canyons themselves. It sent a shiver through him, not of fear, but something older, something close to wonder. As the seasons turned, life began to grow back over the ashes. Grass pushed through black soil, and the air lost its smoky taste. A few new settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of land and quiet. They built new cabins, painted new fences, and tried not to ask too many questions about what had come before. But at night, when the wind picked up, even they felt uneasy. They said the coyotes howled different here, that their cries carried voices half human, half wild. Her mother never left. She lived in a small rebuilt cabin near the river, tending a garden that never seemed to thrive. Some said she still set a place at the table for her daughter. Others said she spoke to the wind, asking it to carry her words west. And the sheriff, he aged faster than most. His hand shook when he lit his pipe, his eyes dimmed. But sometimes, when the night was quiet, he'd walk out to the river again as though expecting to see her there. Barefoot, smiling, her hair tangled with wildflowers. The stories about her only grew. Some said she'd become a spirit, guiding lost travelers across the plains. Others claimed she'd returned once, years later, cloaked in animal skins and carrying a small child with eyes like storm clouds. They said she watched the rebuilt village from the hills before disappearing again, never to be seen. The preacher called it superstition. The young ones whispered it in secret, turning her into legend. But to those who had lived through the fire, her memory was real, alive as the wind. Then one autumn evening, a rider appeared from the south. His horse was thin, his clothes torn, his face marked with dust and travel. He asked for water, then asked if this was the place once called Cedar Hollow. When told it was, he nodded slowly. "I bring word," he said, his voice hoarse. "From the Apache lands." The people gathered once again, hearts caught between fear and curiosity. "There's a woman among them," the rider said. "They call her White Dove. She heals the sick. She speaks both tongues. They say she came from a burned village long ago." The sheriff's heart pounded in his chest. "She's alive?" he whispered. The rider nodded. "Alive, and she sent word. She says the past is coming for you." No one spoke. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low against the horizon. That night, the sheriff sat by the river once more, his lantern flickering. He thought of her, of the night she had ridden away, of the look in her eyes, of the fire that followed. He wondered what she meant by her message, what ghosts she had stirred awake. The water rippled softly beside him, catching the light. For a moment he thought he saw her reflection, faint, smiling sadly, her hair drifting like smoke. He blinked and she was gone, but the wind carried her voice soft as breath, almost lost beneath the rustle of leaves. Not all fires die, it seemed to say. Some just wait. And as the sheriff looked toward the dark hills where the plains met the stars, he knew she was right. Something was coming. Something tied to her, to the man she had chosen, to the night the village had burned. The story wasn't over. Not yet. The air in Cedar Hollow changed after the writer's message. Folks tried to go about their days as they always had, mending fences, tending fields, praying for rain. But the feeling of waiting hung over the place like a cloud that wouldn't move. Every creak of the windmill, every faraway rumble of thunder felt like a warning. The children were quieter now, and the men carried their rifles even when they were just walking down to the river for water. The name White Dove passed from mouth to mouth, sometimes in wonder, sometimes in fear. Sheriff Willard couldn't shake the thought of her. He'd sit on his porch at dusk, pipe in hand, watching the red sky fade to violet. He'd think about that night, the fire, the screams, the girl's cry through the smoke, and how none of it ever truly left him. He still saw her sometimes in dreams, standing at the river's edge, whispering words he couldn't quite hear. He told himself the past was gone, buried under the ashes. But deep down, he knew better. 2 weeks after the stranger came, riders from the fort showed up again. Their commander, a stern man with sharp eyes, asked to see Willard. They met in the sheriff's office, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and dust. "There's been trouble to the south," the commander said, spreading a rough map across the desk. "Settlers near Dry Creek claim the Apache are on the move again. We found 3 wagons burned. Survivors say they saw a woman with them." Willard stared at the map, his jaw tight. "And you think it's her?" The officer nodded. "This White Dove, she's leading them, or at least speaking for them. They don't strike unless someone's guiding their hand. We believe she's stirring them up." Willard's eyes narrowed. "You don't know that. She might be keeping the peace." The officer leaned back, arms crossed. "Peace doesn't come with smoke on the horizon, Sheriff." He paused. "If she's alive and if she's one of them now, then we can't afford to wait for her to make the first move." The words sat heavy in the room. Willard didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and said, "You'll get your message to her before you do anything." The commander looked at him long and hard. "We'll send a scout. But if she's truly gone to their side, there's no message left to send." When the soldiers left, Willard poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in silence. The candlelight flickered across the map, and his thoughts wandered to the river again, to the footprints that faded into the shallows, to the flute music he'd once heard on the wind. That night, as the stars came out, someone knocked on his door. It was a boy, barefoot, dusty, maybe 12 years old. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Sheriff," he said, panting. "Pa says there's someone camped out by the old bridge. Says he saw fire down there." Willard grabbed his coat and revolver and rode out fast. The moon was low, and the world seemed wrapped in silver mist. The river shimmered faintly, carrying the smell of wet earth. When he reached the bridge, he saw it, an old campfire still glowing, the ashes warm, and beside it something small and half-buried in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away the dust. It was a necklace, simple leather with a turquoise bead at its center. He remembered it. She'd worn it the last night she'd been seen. His hand trembled as he closed it in his fist. Then he heard it, a rustle from the trees. He turned fast, gun raised, but saw only a figure slipping away into the darkness, too quick to follow. The sound of hoofbeats echoed once, then faded. The next morning he found tracks near the river, Apache horses, several of them. They'd been close, too close. He told no one about the necklace. Instead, he rode to the fort, asking to speak with the scout the commander had promised to send. The scout was a half-Mexican man named Ruiz, quiet and watchful, with eyes that missed nothing. He'd been out among the Apache before, and the stories said he spoke enough of their tongue to keep himself alive. "You go south," Willard told him, showing the necklace. "If you find her, you tell her this: Cedar Hollow remembers. Tell her not to come back if there's war coming." Ruiz nodded slowly, studying the bead. "She's still alive, then?" "She is," Willard said. "And something tells me she's trying to warn us." Ruiz left before dawn, and for days there was no word. The village carried on, though everyone sensed the quiet edge beneath things. The preacher began keeping watch from the church tower at night, claiming he'd seen lights in the hills. The women whispered of ghosts. The men whispered of revenge. Then on the 7th night, Ruiz returned, wounded, his horse lathered and trembling. The sheriff found him outside the saloon, blood on his shirt, breath ragged. "They're coming," he gasped. "Not to fight, to talk." Willard frowned. "Who?" "The Apache," Ruiz said weakly. "And her. She's with them." By morning, a dozen riders appeared at the edge of the plains, carrying no weapons in sight but arrows slung on their backs. At their center rode a woman draped in soft deerskin, her hair braided with feathers and beads. Her eyes were steady, calm as the dawn. It was her. The villagers watched from behind fences and shuttered windows as the sheriff rode out alone to meet them. The woman dismounted first. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," Willard said quietly. She looked around at the rebuilt homes, the smoke curling from their chimneys. "I never meant for it to burn," she said. "None of it. Then why are you here?" he asked. She reached into her pouch and handed him a small folded paper. "Because it will burn again if you don't listen." He opened it. It was a crude map drawn in charcoal. "Soldiers," she said. "They plan to march through the canyons. They think my people are gathering for war, but they're only moving because the land's dying. There's no water left where they are. The soldiers will meet them there, and they'll fight. No one will win." Willard studied her face. There was something different in her now. Older, harder, but still with that same quiet strength. "You want me to stop them," he said. She nodded. "You're the only one who'll listen." Behind her, one of the Apache men spoke softly, his voice low and warning. She turned slightly, replying in their tongue before looking back at Willard. "They don't trust you," she said. "But they trust that I do." He took a breath, the weight of it settling in his chest. "And if I can't stop them?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Then they'll burn this place again, not out of hate, but to survive." For a moment, the world seemed to go still, the wind, the trees, even the river. Willard could feel the eyes of his town watching from behind him, the soldier's words echoing in his mind. "You're walking a line no one comes back from," he said softly. "So are you," she replied. Before he could speak again, a rifle cracked from the ridge above. The shot tore through the silence and chaos broke loose. The Apache horses reared, shouts filled the air, and the woman was pulled back by one of her men as the sheriff shouted for the shooter to stop. But it was too late. The spell of truce had shattered. By the time Willard reached the ridge, the gunman was gone. The Apache were already riding away, their silhouettes vanishing into the hills. The woman looked back once, her face streaked with dust and firelight. Then, she was gone too. That night, Cedar Hollow braced itself. The soldiers at the fort prepared for battle, claiming the Apache had attacked first. Willard tried to tell them the truth, but the commander wouldn't hear it. "You can't make peace with people who bring fire," he said. But Willard had seen something else in her eyes, something desperate, not vengeful. And he knew then that this wasn't about revenge at all. It was about survival and misunderstanding, and two worlds that kept colliding in the same stretch of land neither would give up. He walked down to the river again, the same spot where her footprints once faded. The moon was bright, the water whispering softly against the stones. He could almost hear her voice in the wind, telling him there was still time. Behind him, in the distance, he could see the glow of campfires from both sides, the soldiers on one ridge, the Apaches on the other. Between them lay the valley, silent and waiting. The next dawn would bring something. Whether it was peace or destruction, no one yet knew. But the sheriff could feel it, the weight of it pressing against his chest like the pause before a storm. And somewhere beyond the hills, a single flute began to play again, soft and haunting, carrying the sound of hope through the smoke. The night before the standoff was too still. Even the crickets had gone quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Willard stood by the riverbank, lantern in hand, watching the faint shimmer of the stars on the water. Across the plains he could see two faint glows, one from the soldiers' camp, one from the Apache fires beyond the ridge. Between them stretched a narrow valley that had seen too much blood already. It was there the next sunrise would decide everything. He felt the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. He had kept this land together through drought, death, and fire. But this felt different. This wasn't just another fight between settlers and the Apache. This was something larger, older, and more final. He could feel it in his bones, in the cold breath of the night wind. He heard soft steps behind him, It was Ruiz, the scout, his face drawn and pale. "They're moving," Ruiz said quietly. "The soldiers will strike at dawn. The commander's tired of waiting." Willard turned sharply. "And the Apache?" "They're watching," Ruiz said. "They know it's coming. The woman, White Dove, she sent a runner tonight. Said if the soldiers fire first, her people won't stop this time." Willard stared out at the horizon where the dark hills met the stars. "Then we've got till dawn to stop it," Ruiz hesitated. "Sheriff, you can't ride into their camp. Not tonight. Not with both sides ready to kill anything that moves." Willard's hand tightened around the lantern handle. "If I don't, there won't be a town left to save. Not again." He saddled his horse and rode out into the darkness, the only light coming from the flicker of the lantern swinging at his side. The air was sharp with the smell of dust and pine. His mind drifted back to her, the girl who once stood barefoot by this same river, dreaming of something beyond the fences and the fear. He thought of the fire that took half the town, the cries, the ashes, and now she was somewhere out there again, standing on the edge of another war. As he neared the canyon, he heard the low sound of drums, soft, steady, like the heartbeat of the land. The Apache fires glowed ahead, flickering against the canyon walls. He stopped at the ridge, lifted the lantern, and waited. After a long silence, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was her. She came forward slowly, her braid catching the faint light, her eyes calm but weary. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "You shouldn't have come. I could say the same to you," he answered. Her lips curved slightly, though there was no smile in it. "I didn't come for war, but the soldiers don't believe that." "They think you're leading an attack," Willard said. "I'm leading people who have nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "The water's gone from their wells. The herds are dying. We came north for food and land to live on, not to fight. But your commander sees an army where there are only starving families." He took a step closer. "You gave me that map to stop the bloodshed. Let me finish what you started. I'll go to them. I'll make them see reason." Her eyes flickered toward the ridge where the soldiers' fires burned faintly in the distance. "You don't know how close they are," she said. "One wrong move and they'll shoot. They don't see faces anymore, only enemies." Willard looked at her a long moment. "And what about your people? Will they stand down if I can stop the soldiers?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They will. For me." He studied her, saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the weariness that came from years of being pulled between two worlds. "You were never meant to carry this alone," he said softly. She looked down, the firelight flickering across her face. "I chose it," she said. "And maybe that was my sin. I thought love could change the world. I thought it could make two enemies see each other as human." "It still can," Willard said. She met his eyes again. "Not if the sun rises on blood." A low rumble echoed across the hills, distant thunder, or perhaps the sound of horses. Both of them turned toward the east. Dawn wasn't far off now. "You have till sunrise," she said. "After that, I can't hold them back." Willard nodded once, then mounted his horse. As he rode away, she stood watching him, her figure outlined by firelight. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the quiet before the storm. He reached the soldiers' camp just before dawn. The air was thick with tension. Men moved quietly among the wagons, checking rifles and saddles, their faces grim. The commander stood by the fire, his uniform spotless even in the dust. "You've got to call this off," Willard said as he dismounted. The commander didn't turn. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Sheriff." "I don't care about jurisdiction," Willard snapped. "You fire on them and it'll be a massacre. Women, children, all of them. This isn't a war camp. It's a migration." The commander finally turned, his jaw tight. "They burned this valley once before. You were here. You know what they're capable of. I also know what drove them to it," Willard shot back. "You push people far enough, they'll do anything to survive. You call that savagery, but I've seen civilized men do worse." The commander's expression hardened. "You've been here too long, Sheriff." "Maybe you've forgotten which side you're on." Willard stepped closer. "If you pull that trigger, there won't be sides left to stand on." The commander didn't answer. He turned toward the east, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the ridge. "At first light," he said coldly. "We move." Willard clenched his fists. "Then I'll stop it myself." Before the commander could speak, the sound of a horn echoed faintly from the hills. The Apache were moving slowly, carefully down the valley. Women and children walked beside the riders, carrying bundles on their backs. It wasn't an army, it was an exodus, but the soldiers didn't see that. They saw movement, dust, shadows. Fingers tightened on triggers. Horses shifted restlessly. Willard pushed through the line of men. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "They're not attacking." No one listened. A single shot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley. The effect was instant. Shouts erupted, rifles blazed, and chaos swallowed the dawn. Willard's horse reared as bullets hissed past. He could see the Apache riders scattering, women running for cover. Smoke filled the air, the sound of gunfire deafening. He saw her then, White Dove, riding hard through the chaos, shouting for her people to fall back. He spurred his horse forward, weaving through the madness. "Stop shooting!" he bellowed, but his voice was lost in the thunder of rifles and hooves. The commander was shouting orders, waving his pistol. "Advance! Don't let them regroup!" Willard rode straight toward him, slamming his horse to a stop. "Call it off!" he roared. "They fired first," the commander yelled back. "No!" Willard shouted, pointing toward the ridge. "Your men did. You'll burn this valley to the ground again." The commander aimed his pistol at him. "Stand down, Sheriff." Willard stared at him, then at the smoke rising behind him. He could see figures falling in the distance, could hear the cries echoing through the canyon, and somewhere amid it all, he heard her voice again calling his name. He turned just in time to see her riding toward him. Her horse streaked with dust, her hair whipping in the wind. She carried no weapon, only a white cloth tied to a stick. She was trying to stop the fight. "Hold your fire," Willard shouted again, but the noise drowned him out. The commander raised his pistol, eyes narrowing. Willard didn't think. He moved. He grabbed the commander's arm just as the gun went off, the shot tearing through the air. The horse beneath her stumbled, the white flag falling from her hand. The sound that followed wasn't war, it was heartbreak. Everything slowed. The smoke curling upward, the cries fading into silence, the look on her face as she fell. Willard dropped to his knees beside her, the dust rising around them. Her eyes fluttered open, searching for him through the haze. "Stop them," she whispered, her voice barely there. "Don't let it happen again." He pressed his hand against hers, his chest tight, the chaos roaring around them like thunder. And as the sun broke over the ridge, painting the valley in golden blood, Sheriff Willard realized the moment he'd feared had come. The past and present had collided once more, and the fire that once burned Cedar Hollow was alive again, this time with no promise of mercy. The drums had started again in the distance, deep and slow. The soldiers reloaded, the Apache gathered their wounded, and between them lay the broken stillness of what could not be undone. Willard lifted his head, eyes burning with smoke and grief. He looked toward the horizon, where the canyon walls met the light, and knew one truth: this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The night after the flames died, the valley lay still as if the earth itself held its breath. The scent of smoke hung thick in the air, carried by a faint wind that whispered over the charred remains of Cedar Hollow. The wooden beams still glowed faintly in the darkness, and the faint crackle of ash was the only sound. Dawn crept over the ridge, casting pale light on what once was a village full of laughter, trade, and simple hopes. Now it stood broken, its silence louder than the gunfire that had torn it apart. Near the remnants of the church, the young woman knelt, her white dress smeared with soot. Her eyes were hollow but alive, as though her soul hovered somewhere between the living and the lost. The memory of his face, the Apache warrior who had vanished into the wilderness, haunted her every heartbeat. He had done the unthinkable, not for vengeance, not for conquest, but for her. Every ember that still burned seemed to whisper his name. The world she once knew had turned to ruin, yet she could not hate him. As the sun rose higher, the surviving villagers gathered in weary silence. A few women clutched rosaries, praying softly, their voices trembling as if unsure heaven still listened. The men stood grim, their faces blackened with soot and disbelief. The sheriff, his badge dulled and shirt torn, looked over what remained of the town. He tried to speak, but his throat caught. For all his talk of order and law, he had been powerless to stop the fire, or the heart that had kindled it. The young woman lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. Someone whispered her name, urging her to leave, to head east where safety and new beginnings might wait, but her feet refused to move. Every road away from the valley felt like betrayal, every step toward a new life like turning her back on what her heart had chosen. By noon, the sun burned high and cruel, and the survivors began to scatter. Wagons rolled away, creaking beneath the weight of what little could be saved. Children cried softly in the heat, clutching tattered dolls or worn blankets. The woman stood at the edge of the dirt road, watching as the last wagon disappeared over the hill. She was alone now, truly and painfully so. Yet deep down, a strange calm settled in her chest. Somewhere beyond those far ridges he was alive. She could feel it. That evening, when the shadows lengthened and the coyotes began their mournful song, she wandered toward the river. The water ran dark and slow, reflecting the fading sky. Kneeling there, she dipped her hands into the cold current and let the soot wash away. She stared at her reflection, a face no longer the same girl who had once dreamed of safety, of belonging. She had crossed an invisible line, one that no prayer or confession could undo. The sound of hooves in the distance made her freeze. Her heart leapt before her mind could reason. She rose slowly, her breath catching. He did not come closer. He only watched from afar, still as stone, the distance between them filled with unspoken things. Fear, longing, guilt, and something deeper still. Then he turned his horse toward the west, into the dimming light, and vanished beyond the rise. That night, she built a small fire near the river and sat beside it until the stars came out. Her thoughts wandered through the ruins of memory, how it all began, how love and fear had tangled until neither could be undone. Maybe the world would never understand what bound them together. Maybe it wasn't meant to. She thought of what he said before everything burned, the words echoing now like a ghost. "If you leave, I will follow the wind until it brings me back to you." Weeks passed. The army came through what remained of Cedar Hollow, surveying the wreckage, asking questions no one could answer. They found tracks, Apache horses, they said, but no sign of him. Some believed he had perished in the blaze. Others claimed to have seen smoke signals far in the canyons, proof he still lived. The young woman didn't speak of him. She helped the soldiers bury the dead, then stayed to rebuild what little she could. Spring returned. The charred earth gave way to green again, timid at first, then bold with color. The sound of birds returned to the valley, their songs echoing through the cottonwoods that had survived the flames. She began tending a small garden near what used to be her family's home. It was quiet work, steady and grounding. Yet every dusk she found herself looking west, always west. One evening, as the sun bled over the mountains, she heard the faintest rustle behind her. She turned, half expecting it to be her imagination again. But it wasn't. He stood a few yards away, his clothes worn, his face lined with exhaustion and sun. The world seemed to stop. Neither spoke. For a long moment the wind was the only voice between them. He stepped forward slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no triumph there, no pride, only a deep, wordless sorrow. He looked around at the rebuilt fences, the fresh earth, the small house rising from the ashes. Then he looked back at her, as though unsure if he still belonged to this world, or to her. She didn't run to him this time. She didn't cry or reach out. She simply stood there, tears gathering quietly as she whispered, "You came back." He nodded once. His voice, rough and low, broke the silence. "I told the wind to remember." They stood like that for a long time, two souls bound by fire standing on ground that had both destroyed and remade them. The world beyond the valley was changing fast. Railroads cut across the plains, telegraph wires carried news faster than wind, and the old ways, his and hers, were vanishing. Yet in that small, forgotten corner of the frontier, something human endured, fragile but alive. As dusk deepened, he looked toward the west again. "They'll come," he said softly. "They won't forget." She took a slow breath. "Then we'll face it," she replied. "Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, a faint smile crossed his face. It wasn't a promise of peace nor a pledge of forever. It was simply a quiet recognition that in all the burning and rebuilding, something greater had survived. When the stars rose over Cedar Hollow that night, they shone brighter than they had in years. The river glimmered beneath them, carrying away the last ashes of what once was. The valley, scarred but breathing again, held the faint hum of life returning, and somewhere in that stillness, the echoes of a woman's cry and a warrior's vow lingered, carried by the wind through the canyons, an old story of love, loss, and the stubborn endurance of the human heart. In the years that followed, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes speak of strange lights flickering near the river, or a lone rider seen at dusk, pausing to look back before fading into the horizon. Most dismissed it as tales told by drifters, but some, hearing the story of the fire and the woman who stayed, would fall silent, gazing west with quiet wonder. And though Cedar Hollow never fully returned to what it had been, it was said that the earth there grew richer each spring, as if something sacred had taken root beneath the ashes, something that neither time nor fire could ever destroy, the memory of two souls who defied the world for a love that refused to die.